The morning of Calabrine's wedding began with stillness, the kind that only settles before a major life decision. Outside the window of her rented suite at Wincliffe Estate, fog was coiled over the cliffs like a silk scarf. The Pacific was barely visible, the tide somewhere out of reach, murmuring like a distant warning. Everything had been curated with precision. Vintage blue and white porcelain, a champagne tower that sparkled like an altar, and rows of white chairs lined up in militant symmetry on the wet grass. The guests hadn't yet arrived, but the house was already pulsing with quiet activity. The scent of eucalyptus candles, the footsteps of the planner adjusting floral centerpieces, the rustle of lace and satin behind dressing room doors. Calla stood in front of the full-length mirror in her slip, her wedding gown still hanging untouched by the window. It was supposed to be a day of certainty, and she had every reason to feel ready. Greyer Lott was, by all measurable standards, a good man. He was structured, educated, well-dressed, and relentless in his calmness. Over the past year, he had appeared in her life like an antidote to chaos, meeting her in the aftermath of her worst creative drought, when even the sentences she typed felt hollow. He read her books without skimming, asked questions about her characters with eerie insight, and never once raised his voice. He brought logic to her spirals and offered order where once there had only been noise. She had told herself that love didn't have to be loud to be real, and yet she couldn't ignore the feeling, that small, churning instinct just beneath her ribs. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was more like friction, the knowledge that her body was bracing for something her mind refused to name. At 9:46 a.m., as she sat on the small velvet ottoman near the window, adjusting the clasp on her grandmother's bracelet, she noticed a small white envelope tucked inside the box that held her shoes. It hadn't been there last night. The envelope was plain, unsealed, and bore no initials or markings. Just one piece of folded ivory paper inside. She unfolded it slowly, the paper crisp like it had just been printed. 7 words typed in neat serif font. He's not who you think he is. Leave. No punctuation, no context. Just a warning like a blade through the middle of a wedding morning. Calla's first instinct was laughter, not out loud but internal. Sharp, bitter, exhausted. Some kind of joke, maybe, or sabotage from a jealous ex or a bored friend. She imagined Rain, her editor and lifelong partner in sarcasm, staging it as a test of conviction before vows. But the envelope felt too calculated. There was no smugness, no humor. The words weren't desperate either. They were clinical, precise. And that was what disturbed her most. It didn't feel like someone begging her to change her mind. It felt like someone presenting a fact, one she was too late to verify. She reread the sentence again and again, her heartbeat growing louder with each pass, until it pulsed in her ears like a drum. She tried to shake it off, to place the letter back and close the box, to resume the day as planned. But something inside her fractured. Not a dramatic break, but a quiet shift, like a fault line beginning to stir. Still, she didn't move. Greyer knocked lightly on the door 10 minutes later, an uncharacteristic break from tradition. Just wanted to say hi, he called through the door. No peeking. Calla cleared her throat. Hi. There was a pause. You okay? She stared at her reflection in the mirror, trying to locate something true behind her eyes. Just nerves, she said. Totally normal, he replied. We're good. I'll see you soon, Mrs. Lott. She didn't respond. After the door closed again and his footsteps faded, she placed the envelope in her coat pocket. Not because she believed it, but because she couldn't pretend it hadn't been written. There were still hours left before the ceremony, but the fog outside was beginning to burn off, revealing the edges of the ocean and the sharp drop of the cliffs. She could have run, she could have left, but instead Calla stood, stepped into her dress with the help of the silent stylist, and walked toward the next chapter of her life with hands that trembled just enough to remind her that something had already changed. Something irreversible. She didn't know yet that it wasn't just a wedding, it was a threshold, and that soon the world she thought she had chosen would begin to unmake itself, one breathless, deliberate hour at a time. The drive to the honeymoon house was longer than expected. Greyer had insisted they take the scenic route, one that wove through the forested backbone of northern Montana, a road unmarked by GPS and riddled with switchbacks that carved the landscape like old scars. Calla had protested gently, asking why they didn't just fly or rent a place closer to a town, but he had smiled and said, "Trust me, You write about solitude like you crave it. This is the real kind. She tried to laugh, to match his energy, but something about the way he said it made her uneasy. It wasn't romantic or even playful. It was definitive, like a thesis being stated before the argument began. They arrived at dusk. The house was bigger than she'd expected, though Grayer had called it a cabin. It was a three-story structure tucked into a ridge, surrounded by pine trees and rock, with heavy, dark windows and a pitched roof that looked like it had been designed for storms. The driveway wound up to a wide steel gate that opened with a remote Grayer kept clipped to the visor. Beyond that was a gravel path and a garage with no windows. As the car came to a stop, Calla felt her stomach tighten. There were no visible neighbors, no distant porch lights, no telephone poles. She couldn't even hear birds, only wind and the faint groan of the trees. Inside, the house was cold and meticulously organized. The furniture was modern, smooth surfaces, deep grays and blacks, polished concrete floors and minimal decoration. No books, no plants, no signs of life. The kitchen smelled like industrial cleaner. The fridge was fully stocked, but each shelf had neat labels. She noticed a printed schedule pinned to the inside of the pantry door. Meal 1, Meal 2, hydration blocks, evening supplements. Each item listed with times and portion sizes. There were no brand names, no familiar packaging. She turned to Grayer with a forced smile, trying to laugh it off. "Did you hire a private nutritionist or a drill sergeant?" He didn't laugh. "I curated everything myself. 6 months. Controlled inputs. You'll feel better than you've ever felt." 6 months, she repeated, hoping she'd misunderstood. He nodded, peeling off his coat. "You said you wanted time away. No distractions. Time to reset creatively and emotionally. I made sure we won't need to leave until spring." She blinked. "But what if I want to go somewhere? Or call someone?" "You won't," he said. "And if you do, we'll talk about it. But right now, I want us to give this our full commitment. No tech, no interruptions, no exits. Just you and me. Total presence." She looked at her phone. No service, no Wi-Fi signal. The house had no landline, no visible router. Even the thermostat was analog. There was no television. Just a sleek stereo system with only 3 albums loaded. Instrumental piano, ambient forest sounds, and something he called cognitive cleansing frequencies. He told her not to worry, that the first few days always felt jarring, that she'd adjust, recalibrate. He used words like clean slate, sensory reset, and behavioral sync. At first she thought it was a joke, maybe an elaborate performance, something for effect. But as the hours passed, it became clear that Grayer wasn't performing. He was executing a plan. That night, Calla didn't unpack. She left her suitcase zipped in the guest bedroom, claiming she wanted to spread out a little before settling into a routine. Grayer accepted her explanation without hesitation. He kissed her on the forehead, like a handler rewarding good behavior. Then he disappeared into what he called his module, a small room downstairs with a locked door and no windows. She heard him moving things around, typing, running water. When she asked what he was doing, he replied through the wall, "Logging the day. It's important to track adjustment." She spent the next few hours walking the perimeter of the house, pretending to admire the architecture while quietly checking the windows for opening mechanisms. Some were painted shut. Others had internal locks that didn't turn. The back door had a keypad. She tried a few obvious codes, dates, names, even 1234. Nothing worked. At midnight, Grayer returned. He handed her a glass of something milky and thick, urging her to drink it as part of the evening wind-down cycle. She took a sip, gagged, and lied, saying she had already brushed her teeth. He didn't press. Instead, he took her hand, led her to the primary bedroom, and tucked her in like a child. Then he lay beside her, fully clothed, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. They didn't speak. In the darkness, she reached for the envelope she had hidden in the lining of her coat, still unsure why she hadn't burned it. She read the line again. "He's not who you think he is. Leave." But now there was no place to leave, too. No exit, no car, no phone, no signal, just miles of forest, winter closing in, and a husband who had stopped speaking like a man and started sounding like a manual. She lay awake, eyes wide open, wondering what day 1 of 6 months really meant. and how far she was willing to go to find out. The third day in the house began with silence that felt sharpened, like something too carefully placed. Calla woke up to find the other side of the bed cold, grayer already gone. Outside the window, the sky was thick with overcast light, casting everything in a shade of blue-gray that made it difficult to tell the time. She checked the small analog clock on the dresser, 6:12 a.m. She could hear distant clinks of pans in the kitchen below, followed by a faint low hum of the stereo playing ambient noise. Wind, water, a soft chime loop that had already begun to make her jaw tighten. She pulled on a sweatshirt and moved quietly downstairs. Grayer was standing barefoot at the stove, already dressed in dark joggers and a slate-colored turtleneck. The kitchen smelled sterile, like boiled oats and something blandly protein-rich. On the counter, 3 ceramic bowls sat in perfect alignment. Each one had measured portions. Hers had half a banana sliced to matchstick size, 4 almonds in a straight line, and a mound of white grain she didn't recognize. It was laid out like a lab sample. No salt, no sugar, not even tea. He greeted her with a smile that felt like an interview response, polished and slightly detached. "You slept through your first REM cycle. That's good," he said, handing her a journal. It had her name printed on the cover in embossed silver. "This is your processing book. Don't edit, don't overthink. Just write." Calla didn't open it. She placed it gently on the table beside her bowl and sat down, watching him as he spooned porridge into his mouth with methodical precision. She asked, "Are we really doing this for 6 months?" Her voice was quiet, not confrontational, more like someone looking for confirmation that what they were experiencing was actually happening. Grayer nodded slowly. "We agreed to the reset, Calla, before the wedding. You said you wanted a complete immersion. No deadlines, no expectations, just space. I thought you meant a vacation, not isolation." "It's not isolation," he said, his tone calm but clipped. "It's detox. Emotional, creative, relational. I spent months designing the protocol. You'll see. The first phase is always disorienting." She looked down at the food but didn't touch it. Her appetite had vanished. The room felt heavy with intention, every object part of some larger plan she hadn't been consulted on. Even the utensils were all the same matte black material, unbranded, unbendable. There was no clutter, no misplaced items, no indication of spontaneity. The space was stunning, but in the same way a showroom was, perfect, untouched, impossible to live inside. After breakfast, Grayer handed her a printed itinerary titled Day 3, Cognitive Loosening and External Awareness. It listed 15-minute blocks of time from 7 a.m. to 9:30 p.m., broken down into tasks like movement meditation, isolated narrative recall, silent walk, nonverbal sharing, and cleansing silence. It looked less like a retreat and more like a psychological experiment. She didn't say anything. She just folded the paper, tucked it into her sweatshirt pocket, and walked outside without asking if she was allowed. The forest that surrounded the house wasn't welcoming. The trees were tall and overgrown, their branches interlocking above to create a canopy that blocked out most of the sky. The path behind the house was narrow, barely more than a trail of disturbed needles, and the air was dry with the sharp smell of sap and cold stone. She wandered down the slope for what felt like half an hour before she heard something strange, something that didn't belong to the forest. It was a sound, faint but deliberate. 3 rhythmic knocks, followed by silence. Then again, 3 knocks. Then nothing. She stopped walking. It was coming from the direction of the small detached garage she had noticed on the first day, but hadn't been able to open. She turned back, slowly making her way up the hill. Her hands were shaking, not from cold, but from that low, instinctive fear that rises when you realize something is watching you. Something just outside the edge of normalcy. By the time she reached the house, Grayer was waiting on the porch. He said nothing about the walk, nor the time she had missed on her schedule. Instead, he gestured toward the living room, where 2 yoga mats had been laid out, symmetrically placed beneath the wide window. "We're doing dual observation today," he said. "I'll mirror you. Don't speak, just move. Trust the response." Calla didn't resist. She lay on the mat, her limbs heavy with disbelief, and allowed him to begin the exercise. For the next 45 minutes, they moved in quiet synchronicity, bending, reaching, breathing, holding poses. Grayer's body was unnervingly fluid, as if he had practiced this routine hundreds of times. Calla mimicked him as best she could, but her mind wasn't with her body. It was still on the knocking, still trying to decide if she'd imagined it, still wondering why the garage was locked and why the air around it felt wrong. After the session, Grayer wrapped her in a gray blanket and handed her a glass of herbal water, whispering that this stage was critical and that he was proud of how open she'd been. She didn't answer. Her skin crawled every time he said the word open. Later that night, when she was alone, she snuck downstairs and stared through the window at the garage. She couldn't see anything, but her breath caught when she noticed faint prints in the snow outside the side door. Too small for Grayer's boots, too many to be just passing wildlife. She leaned closer. The prints circled, then disappeared as if they had been swept. She backed away, heart racing. She didn't know what scared her more, that someone else was out there, or that Grayer knew they were and hadn't said a word. Either way, the isolation was no longer just physical. Something about the house was designed to obscure, to remove her from reality one layer at a time. And whatever that was, it had just begun. Calla began to notice the patterns not because she was observant, but because she had no choice. In a place where every moment was accounted for and every surface had been scrubbed of spontaneity, the smallest deviation stood out like blood on snow. She started counting the number of steps Grayer took from the kitchen to the front door, how long he stirred his tea before drinking it, the precise time he disappeared into his so-called module in the basement. There was a mathematical rhythm to his existence. No wasted movement, no missed intervals. He was living by some internal metronome she couldn't hear, but could feel in her bones. Every morning at 5:42, the stereo would play the same four-note sequence. At 10:15, a second chime would sound. The meals arrived at exactly 7 or 12:30 and 6:15. Every sixth evening, he replaced the air filters in the ventilation system. She wasn't told to notice any of it, but it became the only way she could keep a grip on time. By the ninth day, the silence between them had become the house's dominant language. They spoke in short, controlled exchanges. Grayer rarely asked questions, but offered frequent commentary on her progress. He would nod approvingly if she completed a writing session or held eye contact longer than 30 seconds. He used words like integration and alignment, phrases that sounded borrowed from a textbook rather than born from emotion. When she asked to call her sister, just once, even just to leave a voicemail, his expression didn't shift. He simply said, "You made a choice to come here. We're not introducing chaos into the system, not when you're starting to respond." Respond to what? She wanted to ask, but the words didn't come. She'd stopped asking real questions days ago. Every time she had pushed back, it had only led to longer exercises, prolonged silence, or a thin, painful smile from Grayer that felt like being watched through a microscope. It was during one of these long silences, while pretending to meditate in the study, that Calla heard the sound again. It came not from the garage this time, but from inside the walls, just above the baseboards. A faint scrape, like something being dragged along metal. Then two deliberate knocks, not loud but timed, 3 seconds apart. She opened her eyes and looked around. The study was empty, the door half closed. She moved carefully toward the corner of the room, kneeling beside the vent closest to the floor. There it was again, scrape, knock, pause. She reached for the screws holding the grate in place, only to discover they were fake. The whole thing was decorative, glued into position. No airflow came from it, just the sound. That night, she waited until Grayer went to sleep. He had begun taking a heavy herbal tonic before bed, which seemed to knock him into deep, unmoving slumber within minutes. Calla waited in her room with the lights off, watching the red numbers of the analog clock tick past midnight. When she was certain the house was quiet, she returned to the study and sat cross-legged beside the vent. She whispered softly, "Hello?" There was no response. She tried again. "Is someone there?" A pause, then a single knock. Her skin went cold. She whispered again, more urgently, "Can you hear me?" 3 knocks, then a scrape, a soft tapping sound that seemed to form a rhythm, not quite Morse code, but deliberate. Then a word, low, hoarse, male, almost too soft to catch. "Don't speak, hear." She froze, adrenaline spiking through her chest. The voice wasn't Grayer's. It was older, rougher, exhausted. She leaned in, whispering, "Who are you?" No answer came. Just the retreating sound of movement through the walls, slow, careful, as if whoever had spoken was crawling backward through a narrow tunnel. The next morning she said nothing. She joined Grayer for breakfast, smiled when he complimented her posture, nodded during his monologue about the integrity of stillness. But her heart wasn't with him anymore. It had gone into the walls, following that voice. Over the next 2 days, the house seemed to shift, subtly. Doors began to close a little faster than before. Lights flickered. Grayer grew quieter, more watchful. He began asking questions again, small ones at first. "Did you sleep well? What did you write yesterday?" Then more pointed, "Have you been in the East Corridor? Why were you awake at 1:10 a.m.? She lied smoothly, calmly, telling him what he wanted to hear, mimicking the tone he used on her. She learned to answer without giving information. She wore neutrality like armor. And still, at night, she returned to the vent. On the fourth night, the voice returned. "Name," it whispered. She hesitated, then answered softly. "Calla." "Breen." A pause. "You're the writer." Another pause. "Did he tell you why you're here?" She shook her head, then realized that was useless. "No," she whispered. "He said it was a reset." A rasp of breath. "They always say that." Calla leaned closer. "Who are you?" There was a long silence before the reply came. "Joss." The name meant nothing to her yet, but the sound of it, real, human, unscripted, was enough to bring tears to her eyes. She pressed her fingers against the wall, not expecting anything but needing contact. For the first time in days, she felt less alone. "Are you in the walls?" she asked. Another long pause. "Below them, and behind." She was silent. Then, "Why?" Joss answered with a truth so sharp it cut the breath from her lungs. "Because I tried to help the last one, and I failed." She didn't sleep that night. She lay awake listening to the sounds of the house, no longer trusting any of them, the ambient music, the controlled rhythms, even her own breath. Because now, finally, something in her had shifted. The fear was no longer abstract. It had a voice, and it knew more than she did. The snow came early that week, blanketing the trees and roof with a silence more complete than any music Grayer had programmed into the stereo system. It wasn't the kind of soft, romantic snow you saw in holiday films. This snow was heavy, flat, suffocating, more like an erasure than a decoration. The roads leading out of the house disappeared first, then the trails around the forest's edge. By mid-morning, Calla couldn't see more than 10 feet beyond the porch without everything dissolving into white. She stood by the window in the study, arms crossed over her chest, her breath forming slow, controlled clouds against the glass. She hadn't spoken to Joss in 2 days, not because he had vanished, but because she had. Something in her had gone quiet, dulled by the steady beat of compliance. She had started taking the drinks Grayer gave her. She had begun following the schedule, at least partially. She had even stopped asking where his data went, the charts he kept of her heart rate, her dreams, her eye contact duration. None of it made sense to her, and she no longer had the energy to pretend it did. But she was watching. Every movement, every adjustment Grayer made, she recorded in her head. When he changed the air filters, when he swept the hallway floors in a clockwise pattern, when he measured the temperature of her bathwater and logged it without comment. Every night he disappeared into his module, sometimes for 5 minutes, sometimes for 2 hours. She learned to recognize the pattern in his absences. And more than that, she noticed when he broke them. It happened for the first time on day 23. Grayer left for his usual evening walk around the perimeter of the house, something he did to remain grounded in the environment, as he explained. He usually returned within 22 minutes, but on that night, he didn't come back for almost 45. When he entered through the garage, he looked pale, off balance. His eyes scanned the room quickly before settling on her. "You've moved something," he said. Calla looked up from the chair where she'd been pretending to read. "I haven't." He approached, slow and too measured. "The meditation pillows. They've shifted. I aligned them for a reason." She blinked, then stood. "I didn't touch them." He stared at her, expression unreadable. Then, to her relief, he nodded once and turned toward the kitchen. But the damage was done. He had broken his own rhythm. That meant something. She just didn't know what. Later that night, after the house went still, she returned to the study. The vent was cold, untouched, but she tapped anyway. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 knocks. It took longer than usual, but eventually the whisper came. "You still there?" "Yes," she breathed. "I thought something happened. You didn't answer last night." "I was hiding," Joss said. His voice sounded different, strained, lower. Grayer did a sweep. He knew something was off. "Why are you hiding in the wall?" she asked again. "Why stay here?" There was a pause, then the sound of movement. Cloth against wood, something shifting close to the vent. Then his voice again. "Because they don't expect someone to stay broken. And that's what I am to them. Broken protocol, failed handler." Kala leaned closer. "What happened to the last woman? The one you tried to help?" Another long pause. "She trusted me too late," he said finally. "She got out of the house, but not the woods. They found her. They erased her file, told the next woman she'd had a psychotic break, and fled the reset. They say she was never really here." Kala felt her stomach twist. "And what do they say about you?" "That I'm part of the architecture now. Like furniture that doesn't work but looks good in the corner." Her eyes stung with unshed tears, but she kept her voice even. "Why haven't you left?" "You think I haven't tried?" he said, not angry, just tired. "This house is part of a network. It looks isolated, but it's watched. Every exit is mapped. I've been in the crawl spaces, the maintenance shafts. I know the whole floor plan, and I know every route leads back here, eventually." Kala gripped the edge of the vent. "Then what do we do?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, there was a sound, a rustling, then a scrape of something metal. Moments later, a thin strip of paper slid through the gap between the vent and the wall. On it, in neat, small handwriting, was a map. Not of the house, but of something below it. A tunnel. A route she hadn't known existed. "This is under the module," Joss said softly. "Grayer doesn't know I accessed the old blueprints. It was a maintenance escape tunnel for engineers. Never updated when they bought the property. The exit leads through the rocks, south of the slope." She traced the line with her finger, heart pounding. "Why show me this now?" she asked. "Because your time is closing," he said. "I've seen the signals. You're reaching the compliance plateau. That's the final stage before conditioning becomes permanent. If we don't get out soon, you'll stop wanting to." She swallowed hard, gripping the map like a lifeline. "Why help me?" There was silence. Then finally Joss replied, "Because I couldn't save her. But maybe I can save you." Kala didn't sleep that night. Instead, she sat with the map beneath her pillow, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, counting each minute that passed until the morning came, and Grayer asked her, just as he always did, how she was feeling. And for the first time, she lied with confidence. "I feel aligned," she said and smiled. The days that followed moved with an eerie precision that made Kala feel like she was walking through someone else's dream, a world constructed so perfectly that its artificiality became its own kind of horror. Grayer's routine became sharper, more watchful. He started waking up before she did, already dressed, already documenting. He stopped calling the house their retreat and began referring to it as a phase. Whenever she questioned something, why her shoes had been moved to the mudroom overnight, why the fridge was now locked with a key card, why the writing exercises had shifted from creative prompts to personal confessionals, he would respond with his usual gentle authority. "The phase is evolving," he would say. "You're progressing beautifully. It's time to start peeling the final layers." There were now cameras, she was sure of it. Not visible ones, Grayer would never be that clumsy, but sensors perhaps, or thermal readers tucked inside the light fixtures. Every time she moved, she felt as if something unseen was reacting. The stereo played more frequently now. Loops of low-frequency tones layered beneath spoken affirmations that drifted through the speakers when she was alone. "Clarity lives in surrender. You are not what you were. Resistance is fear, disguised." At first she tried to ignore them. But one afternoon, while staring at her reflection in the darkened glass of the living room window, she realized she had begun whispering the phrases under her breath. Not because she believed them, but because her mind was starving for language. Joss had gone silent. For nearly 4 days there was no sound behind the vent, no whispers, no paper notes. Kala feared the worst. She left 3 knocks every night, waited in the dark with her heart in her throat. Nothing came. She even risked sneaking down to the basement door that led to Grayer's module, but found it sealed with a new electronic lock and a fresh panel bolted over the hinges. When she pressed her ear to the wood, all she could hear was the faint hum of machines. On the fifth night, after a day spent in complete silence, as instructed by the deep stillness portion of her new schedule, Calla sat in the study and tapped again. This time, instead of a whisper, she heard the sudden metallic grind of something being dragged. Then a voice, lower, hoarser, desperate. "Are you alone?" She jumped, leaning toward the vent. "Joss, where have you been?" He sounded weak, strained. "They tried to flush the system, recalibrate everything. I had to stay dark." Calla's heart pounded. "They know about you." "Not yet, but they know someone has disrupted the pattern. That's why he's accelerating your cycle. You're not supposed to be this lucid." She swallowed, trying to keep her voice steady. "The map you gave me, it's still good?" "Yes," Joss said, "but you have to move soon. Tonight or tomorrow. After that, he starts the memory modulation, the food, the supplements, the sleep cycle. They're all part of it. After that phase begins, you'll forget what you want." A cold sweat broke out on the back of her neck. She had already noticed the edge of her memory starting to blur. She forgot the names of streets from her old neighborhood. She had trouble recalling the last book she published. Even the voice of her sister, once so distinct, now sounded generalized in her mind, like a recording heard through a thick wall. She had thought it was stress. She now understood it was something else entirely. "How do I get to the tunnel?" she asked. Joss responded with another scraping sound. Then another strip of paper was pushed through the vent. This one was more precise. A time, a sequence of steps, and a phrase. "Mata hatch, under thermal coil. I'll open the exit from my side at 2 a.m., he said. "The path is narrow. You'll crawl 20 meters through a slope, then drop into the secondary shaft. Once you pass that, you're out of the range." "What about you?" There was a long pause. "I'll follow, but I have to make sure no one traces it back. I'm not like you. I've been here too long. My mind, I don't always know what's real anymore. But I know this. You are. That means you have to go first." She didn't respond at first. Her throat felt too tight to speak. Finally, she whispered, "I'm not leaving without you." "You will," he said, "because you still know your name, and I want someone out there to remember mine." At 1 a.m., Calla began the process. She dressed in her warmest clothes, layering soft fabrics beneath her outer coat to avoid making sound. She packed a single bag with only what she needed: the journal, 2 water bottles, a protein bar she'd hidden, and the original envelope, the one she received before the wedding. She didn't know why she brought it. Maybe because it was the only physical reminder that someone, somewhere, had tried to warn her before all of this began. She moved carefully down the hallway, avoiding the floorboards she had learned would creak. Grayer was asleep, or at least his room was dark, and his tonic glass was empty on the nightstand. The house was silent, but it felt thick with presence, like walking through a dream you hadn't woken from yet. She found the thermal coil in the basement behind a panel marked "Service Access Only." It was screwed shut, but Joss had told her how to twist the bolts just enough to snap the inner mechanism. She did. The panel dropped forward with a soft click. Behind it was a dark crawl space, no taller than 2 feet, with cold air rushing through it from below. She took one last look over her shoulder, not at the house, but at everything she was choosing to leave behind. The confusion, the reprogramming, the slow theft of her mind. Then she slipped inside the tunnel, dragging the bag behind her. The crawl space was tighter than she expected. Jagged metal scraped at her jacket, and her breath came fast, fogging up the narrow passage. She could barely move her knees. Every sound echoed, magnified in the tight space. She thought of Joss crawling here, day after day, surviving in shadows, speaking through vents like a ghost. And she thought of the woman before her, the one he had tried to save, the one they had erased. She wouldn't be erased. At exactly 2:12 a.m., she dropped into the second shaft, rolled against the stone wall, and caught her breath. There was no one there, only snow, cold, blinding, open. She stumbled into it, not knowing where to go, but knowing she was finally outside the program, outside the walls, outside him. And she ran, not toward anything, just away, toward the sound of her own breath, toward the first truth she'd heard in weeks. She was still herself, and she was not alone. The cold hit her like a wall. As Calla staggered out of the shaft and into the open, snow swirled around her in thick, angry gusts, turning the night into a blur of white and gray. The wind sliced through her layers and stung her face, tearing at her breath as she tried to orient herself. She had no sense of where she was. The tunnel had deposited her in a narrow ravine surrounded by jagged rock and pine, with no signs of civilization in any direction. Her boots sank deep into the snow with each step, and her fingers, already numb, trembled as she tried to zip her coat up tighter. The bag slung across her shoulder bounced against her side, its contents now feeling absurdly inadequate for what lay ahead. She had no map, no phone, no compass. Only instinct and the sharp echo of Joss's last words. Once you pass the shaft, you're out of range. That meant Grayer couldn't track her, at least not directly, but the snow would slow her, and it would take time before she could reach anyone, if there even was anyone nearby to reach. For the first time since entering the house, she felt truly afraid, not of being watched or manipulated or controlled, but of being lost, of nature itself turning against her. Still, that fear felt cleaner than what she had left behind. It had edges she could understand. It didn't pretend to love her. Calla began walking, forcing herself to choose a direction based on the slope of the land. She remembered that Joss had mentioned a trail leading south, down into a river basin. If she could find that river, it might lead to a ranger station, or even a highway. Her boots crunched through the snow with slow, careful steps, and she kept her eyes down to avoid slipping on unseen ice. The wind screamed louder the higher she climbed, but she kept moving, one foot in front of the other, teeth clenched, lungs burning. She didn't know how long she walked. Maybe an hour, maybe more. Time stretched in the snow, each minute identical to the last. Her legs began to ache, and her vision blurred. At one point, she tripped and fell hard onto her knees, the impact jarring enough to make her gasp. She lay there for several seconds, the cold seeping in through her pants, wondering if this had been a mistake. What if she had misunderstood the map? What if Joss had been wrong, or lying, or already caught? What if there was no road, no one coming, nothing but white forever? And then she saw it, a light, dim and flickering, maybe a quarter-mile ahead, nestled between the trees. Not a flashlight, not a headlamp, a steady warm glow, orange like firelight behind glass. Her heart leapt. She stumbled to her feet, forcing her legs to move again, faster this time. She half ran, half slid down the incline, slipping once on a patch of ice and landing hard, but not stopping. Her breath came in frantic bursts. As she got closer, she saw the outline of a structure, a small cabin or ranger station, old but intact, with smoke curling from the chimney. She nearly wept with relief. Calla pounded on the door with the last of her strength, shouting, "Please, please, is someone there?" A moment passed, then another. She pounded again. Finally, the door creaked open a few inches. A man's face appeared, weathered and suspicious. He looked to be in his 50s, with a scruffy beard and eyes that narrowed instinctively. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. "Get in here. You'll freeze to death." She stumbled inside, collapsing onto the wooden floor. Heat hit her like a slap. Real heat, from a roaring wood stove in the corner. The man shut the door quickly and threw a thick wool blanket around her shoulders, guiding her toward a wooden bench beside the stove. "Where the hell did you come from?" he asked. She could barely form words. "Cabin, North Ridge, underground tunnel." He stared at her for a moment, then fetched a thermos and poured her a steaming cup of something that smelled like herbal tea. "You're one of them," he said softly. "From that place." She looked up sharply. "You know about it?" He nodded grimly. "Everyone in these parts knows about it. Government research, private therapy retreats, reprogramming centers. Call it what you want. People go up there. They don't always come back. And the ones who do, don't usually talk about it." "I didn't go willingly," she said, voice shaking. "My husband, Grayer, he trapped me there. Told me it was a reset. I thought it was real. I thought he loved me." The man said nothing for a moment. Then he pulled a radio from the shelf and clicked it on. "Name's Ed," he said. "I'm a seasonal fire lookout. Signal up here's shit in winter, but I've got a backup line I can use to get someone to pick you up. You're lucky. If the storm had come any heavier, I wouldn't have seen the light on the ridge. You'd be gone. Calla sipped the tea slowly, feeling warmth return to her hands, her cheeks, the tip of her nose. Her body was starting to tremble from adrenaline and exhaustion. She nodded, barely able to say thank you. Ed moved efficiently, reporting her situation to a distant voice over the radio. There would be a snowcat coming by dawn, he said. A ranger team trained for rescue. She sat by the fire and stared into the flames, listening to Ed's footsteps move around the cabin. He gave her space, sensing she wasn't ready to speak. Her thoughts were still with Joss. She imagined him somewhere below, waiting in the dark. Had he escaped too? Had he managed to lock the system behind her like he promised? Would he find another way out? Or would he vanish, folded back into the walls like he always feared? She pulled the journal from her bag and turned to the last page. Her handwriting was jagged, the ink from her earlier entries smudged by damp and cold. She tore out a page and wrote something new. If someone finds this, his name was Joss. He lived in the dark to help me see. She folded it, placed it inside the lining of her coat, and leaned back. The fire crackled. The wind screamed outside. But for the first time in weeks, the world felt like it belonged to her again, and she would never give it back. The morning after her escape was not triumphant. It wasn't cinematic or symbolic or redemptive. It was slow and swollen with confusion, and Calla Breen spent most of it staring at the ceiling tiles of a medical triage room in a ranger station 50 miles south of where she had emerged from the tunnel. Her body ached in places she hadn't known could ache. Her muscles were locked with tension, and her throat was raw from exposure and panic. A nurse came in every 30 minutes to check her vitals. No one asked too many questions. It was as if they knew not to, or maybe they had seen this before. Maybe she wasn't the first woman to come down from that mountain not knowing how to explain what had happened to her. She didn't speak much, not that day and not the next. She answered when spoken to. Yes, her name was Calla Breen. No, she didn't need to be hospitalized. No, she didn't want to call any family. Yes, she had been part of a therapeutic program. And no, she didn't have any desire to return. She gave them just enough to keep them from pressing harder. She knew the danger of over-explaining. She had learned in the house that too much honesty could be used against you. The less she gave, the more she kept. The more she kept, the safer she felt. They let her leave the ranger station on the third day. A social worker from Missoula named Celine was assigned to drive her to a temporary housing facility in the city, a place usually reserved for domestic abuse survivors, patients recovering from cult extraction, and occasionally journalists who'd gotten too close to off-grid militia activity. Calla sat in the back of the transport vehicle and watched the mountains recede in the side view mirror. The world beyond the house looked too bright, too open, like a movie set built without walls. She wasn't ready for it, but she had no choice now. Her face had returned to her. Her body was hers again. She just didn't know what to do with it. In Missoula, she kept a low profile. No public appearances, no press. She didn't go online, didn't open her old email accounts, didn't check her publishing contracts. She knew the questions were coming. Her disappearance had made headlines back in Seattle. There had been articles. Famous romance novelist vanishes days after wedding. Mystery deepens around isolated literary figure. Where is Calla Breen? She avoided them all. She asked Celine to handle the paperwork and requests. Celine agreed, though she warned her that avoiding everything would only work for so long. Calla started writing again, but not fiction. Not yet. She kept a long notebook, handwriting only, page after page, unpacking what had been done to her inside the house. The routines, the phrases, the conditioning, the false tenderness. She wrote in detail, sometimes graphically, not because she wanted to relive it, but because she knew memory had a way of warping itself when left unrecorded. She wrote down everything she could remember about Greer, his speech patterns, the foods he approved of, the books he allowed, the way he framed abuse as progress. She even recorded the moments where she had nearly believed him. Those were the hardest to admit, not because she blamed herself, but because she understood now just how complete the system had been. It hadn't just isolated her. It had remade her, molecule by molecule, thought by thought, and she wrote about Joss. She didn't know if he had escaped. She didn't know if he was alive. She had no way of finding out. His name wasn't registered anywhere official, no records, no social trace, as if he had already been erased long before she met him. But she remembered his voice. The way it sounded behind the vent, the quiet heartbreak in his tone when he said, "You still know your name." She had whispered it to herself every day since. Calla Breen. Calla. Calla. Over and over, like a spell. 2 weeks after her release, she received a package at the housing facility. No return address, just her name, printed in neat capital letters. Inside was a single item, a small tape recorder, old and scuffed, with a fresh cassette already loaded. She stared at it for a long time before pressing play. Joss's voice, not frantic, not recorded in panic, just steady and quiet, like a letter read aloud. "I don't know if this will reach you," he began, "but if it does, I need you to know something. You weren't wrong to leave me behind. I needed to stay. I had to see the system through to its end. Not to destroy it. That was never possible. But to fracture it, to break a link. You were that fracture. They'll spend months covering your exit, denying it. You'll be called unstable, a liar, maybe worse. Let them. They only know how to fight what they can name. And you, Calla, you're beyond names now." The tape went quiet for a moment, then continued. "Don't look for me. Not because I'm dead, I'm not, but because my freedom isn't the kind you can watch. I'll be in the walls of 100 places now. I'll be in the cracks of stories people are too afraid to tell. But you should be seen. Speak, write, create, or don't. But don't disappear. Not when your voice could be the map someone else needs to get out." The tape clicked to a stop. Calla didn't cry. She just sat there with the recorder in her lap, the tape still warm from motion. Then she rewound it and listened again. 6 months later, Calla Breen released a book, not under her own name, but under initials. CB. The title was simple, The Program. It wasn't marketed as a memoir. It didn't have an author photo. It appeared on shelves without fanfare. But within days it began to spread. Quietly, word of mouth, underground reading groups, survivor networks, therapists, shelters. Pages were photocopied and passed along. Entire chapters were read aloud in anonymous forms. No one had to say it was real. Every woman who read it already knew. Calla declined all interviews. She didn't explain the story. She didn't confirm the details. She simply kept writing. Not for headlines, not for publishers, but for the girl who would one day find herself in a house where the windows don't open and the clocks never change and love is measured in obedience. She wanted that girl to have a voice in her pocket, a sentence to hold on to, a reason to keep whispering her own name into the dark. Calla never returned to her old life. She didn't want to. Instead, she built something new, small, private, quiet. She taught creative writing in a women's recovery center under an assumed name. She planted a garden. She adopted a black dog with a crooked ear. She kept the tape recorder in her nightstand, always loaded, always rewound. Some nights, when the wind picked up and the trees outside groaned like floorboards, she would lie awake and imagine Joss somewhere far off, still moving through the walls, still listening for the sound of someone waking up to their own voice again. And she would say it aloud, just once, "I'm still here."